Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of my favorite parts of the year, the part where we actually get to talk about some, revolution, some real, times changing stuff. So let's jump right into it. So we are going to look at the causes and effects of the Atlantic revolutions during 1750 to the 1900s. And this is also the same time that we start to see this development of a national identity, something that governments would begin to harness and use for themselves. This is also where we get the idea of democracy and liberalism from. So, really, what we are going to be looking at is we're going to answer this question in today's lecture. It's how did the rise in the diffusion of the Enlightenment throughout, or Enlightenment thought, influence revolutions throughout the world and rebellions against their existing governments? So when we are talking about the world, the 1750 time period that we're in, the world is really split into two halves. You have the old world and you have the new world. Like, even though it's not that new anymore, we've been around the block, right? It's still called the new world. And you have all of these European countries who have essentially just carved up the Americas for their own, and they start governing them in ways that are not necessarily agreeable to the people who are growing up here and building a life for themselves. So that's the reason why we are going to talk about the revolutions. So if you didn't know this, I hope you did. 1776 is when the American Declaration of Independence came about. But the British didn't recognize American independence until 1783. We didn't have a constitution, a version of the Constitution until 1787. It's like, hey, we're independent from Britain, but wait, we forgot to figure out how to govern ourselves. Crap, let's, throw this together. Then you start to see these revolts spark, these little sparks throughout the rest of the world. You have Tupac Amaru in Peru, you have the outbreak of revolution in France, the Haitian Revolution, you've got the Reign of Terror and the beheading of Louis XVI, you've got Napoleon's rise to power, you've got Hidalgo in Mexico, and then the Spanish independence, and then, just a whole bunch of craziness in such a short amount of time, or seemingly short amount of time. So there are a lot of shared ideas, and the reason why we call them the Atlantic Revolutions is because they share ideas and they also share the Atlantic Basin. And this Atlantic Basin was actually, what is thought the world of intellect and culture was exchanged, because you had to go back and forth and you use the Atlantic Ocean. So the ideas that animated the Atlantic revolutions were derived from the European Enlightenment, which we have talked about. These ideas were shared and spread, through word of mouth, through newspapers, books, pamphlets, sitting and chit-chatting in somebody's salon. And at the heart of all of this was the notion that human political and social arrangements could be engineered, they could be made and improved, and to improve human actions, which is a novel concept because before this, you have to understand that the kings, those in charge, dictated your way of life, but now everybody is using the Enlightenment ideas to say, what if we could actually make like a social contract that could improve the lives of humans in actions? It's a pretty grand idea. So the conventional and long established ways of thinking came under attack, and the kings themselves and the royalty of Europe felt personally attacked, and the nobility, as they should have. I'm not going to, dwell too much on the American Revolution because you're going to get a lot of it later on, or you've gotten a lot of it already. So you should know that the Declaration of Independence was signed and sent to King George in 1776, and it generated a federal constitution in 1787. And there were 13 colonies that formally were separated and then decided to unite under a new nation. Now, this was the first of a series of upheavals. But what really changed from the American Revolution, because it was a movement to preserve the existing liberties of the colonies rather than to create new ones. Now, if you actually look at the social structure of the American Revolution, you had the upper, middle, and lower class. Well, in the colonies, the upper class were those who were tied directly to the king. And then the middle class were the people who were, pulling themselves up their bootstraps. They were making money for themselves. They were making name for themselves. I think of Hamilton when I start talking about this in particular, because it's basically somebody saying that you can come here, work your butt off, and move up, move your station up in life. But that middle class is essentially the ones who felt the effects of the taxes the most. They were the hardest working, they were making the money, they were the merchants selling the products that were coming off the ships, and they were the ones who were paying the taxes on all of it. So when this middle class, this wealthy middle class, got upset that Britain started to impose taxes, they were not upset because the taxes were imposed on everybody. They were specifically upset because they were being imposed upon them. They wanted to maintain their existing way of life before Britain started to assert their, authority. We'll talk about this. Don't worry. So they weren't exactly, creating this revolution to completely change the way their society was. They were just trying to force Britain out to keep the life that they had known and to keep it going, and everything there with it, I should say, also. So it wasn't that novel of idea. It was a novel idea because for the first time in human history, I don't know if animals have done this or not. I haven't studied animals, but I study human history. So for the first time in human history, a colony revolted against the mother country, and the colony won. So never had that been done. And that's one of the reasons why the American Revolution is so revolutionary. Another reason, we'll get there, is because it inspired all of the others. So I talked about taxes in the last slide. So why were all of these taxes imposed? Well, Britain needed the money, plain and simple, because it went to war with France. They were at war in Europe and also here in the Americas. So because Britain fought a war on the American colonies' behalf, the British authorities thought it was best that the American colonies pay for that national debt through the rise in taxes and tariffs. So this is the first time in 1775 that Britain had actually said, hey, we've kind of had this hands-off affair with the colonies, but y'all need to step up and, pay your part now. Britain was just simply exercising its imperial power. But the issue is that they were doing this without offering the American colonies any representation in British Parliament. So this upset the American colonists. And they were armed with the ideas of the Enlightenment, popular sovereignty, natural rights, consent to the governed. So they waged an entire war that the American colonies were never supposed to win. And by 1781, they had actually prevailed with the help of the French, who had, ironically, still had a monarchy themselves. So the monarch of France agreed to help free the colonies of the Americas from the British monarchy. Oh, my brain hurts. Like, could you not see what was coming? If I could go back in time, I would ask that. but I can't, unfortunately, yet. Not yet, anyway. Maybe Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure will, inspire somebody to come up with it. Anyway, so the French helped out the American colonies. Basically, their hatred over the British was more than their hatred over, one another's political ideals. So they band together. And the rest is history. Right. So for much of the 17th and 18th century, the British colonies in North America had a great deal of autonomy, as I was saying before. British government didn't really concern itself with the internal affairs and conflicts of the North American colonies, because a lot of it was dominated by, those property owning settlers, right? So you give them something that they can, self-govern and, feel like they've got some power, and they'll be okay. And the colonists actually regarded this autonomy as a birthright and as a part of their heritage. Many of the colonists stopped seeing themselves as British citizens and started seeing themselves as American. And this is where that disconnect started to happen between what was happening in an island, 3,000 miles away or whatever it is, to what was going on in the colonies at this time. No one, and I mean no one, really wanted to break away from the British Empire because they did provide the colonies with protection and access to the British markets with very few drawbacks. But there were some drawbacks to all of this. You had to have complete and supreme love of the king. And well, for many colonists, that was a little bit too much. This is one of the infamous paintings of George Washington and his men crossing the Delaware off to war. So, I mean, things were, pretty good in the United States considering, all the things that were going on. There were class distinctions that were very real and very visible, as I was mentioning before. But there was also this large availability of land. And that's because they were kicking Native Americans off of it and they were killing them out. First use of biological warfare. Fight me on it. I will argue with you. There was a scarcity of people also. The colonies were not as populated as we might like to think of them today. And there was a lot of absence of both a titled nobility and a single established church. That meant that much of social life here in the colonies was much more open than it was in Europe because you didn't have the church like eyeball watching you everywhere you went. There were no legal distinctions that that separated the clergy and the aristocracy and the commoners like they did in France. France had the three estates. All men in the United States enjoyed the colonies enjoyed some, level of freedom and some, of the same status before the law, excluding black slaves and white women. Still seen as property, y'all. We've talked about this. But because because of the free men enjoying some of the same status, that meant that poverty was less and there was more economic opportunity. You really could, hoist yourself up and work hard and make something of yourself. Hamilton, again, he was a bastard. He was an orphan from, an island in the Caribbean who moved to New York, and the rest is history. He built our banking system here in the United States. It's a pretty good deal. It's a pretty good deal. So let's talk about the French Revolution for un moment. So this is a timeline of the events of things. Now, I love talking about the French Revolution because they try so hard. I mean, they really do try just so hard, y'all. So French soldiers were returning from, helping the Americans beat the British to, all of this enthusiasm. Like if they can do it, if the Americans can do it, then we can do it here in France. At this point in time, France was bankrupt, y'all. Like they were bankrupt. Nobody had any more money at this point in time. And Louis the 16th had not, okay, so Louis the 16th, not the dude who built Versailles. That was the Sun King. That was Louis the 14th. Okay. Louis the 16th knew that there needed to be a tax reform. So he called the Estates General, which contained representatives of the three estates. This is the legal order that we were talking about, the clergy and the nobility and the commoners. So the first two states made up just 2% of the population, but held like 98% of the wealth. Sound familiar? Because it kind of should. So everyone else was a commoner, and they fell into that 2% that were utterly poor. This picture should also look kind of familiar. This is the nobility and the clergy being carried along by, a commoner. So this is how you should really look at it. So the first estate was the clergy. There was 130,000 people. Right? Okay, cool. That's a lot. The nobility, the second estate, had, anywhere from 120 to 350,000 people. So let's top it out on the back end of that. Let's say it's 350,000 people. That is 480,000 people in the first two states. The third estate had 27 million. There's no way around that one. All right? There's no way around that one whatsoever. So in 1789, there were representatives of the third estate that formed their own special group called the National Assembly. And their main idea, their claim, was to have the sole authority to make the laws in the country. Because if the third estate has 27 million people, then they're the ones that should be in charge of ruling the country. A few weeks after this, they drew up the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was very similar to the American Declaration of Independence, that basically said that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Again, emphasis on men. Here's an example of the articles that come directly from the Declaration. Again, you see liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. There's sovereignty in here. There's liberty and freedom. So you can see that there are some very similar, phrases and language used between the two. Well, let's talk about the tennis court for a second. So the French Revolution was driven by sharp conflicts within French society. So going back to this tennis court oath for a second. When the third estate decided to go and do this, they were locked out of the assembly. And they were basically told that if you're going to have these heretical ideas, you are not going to be allowed in. So what did they do? Did they go home? No, they just went across the street to a tennis court, or to a tennis court, and basically agreed how to govern the country. I'm not even kidding you. So members of the nobility obviously resisted this whole idea. The nobility also resented the monarch's efforts to subject themselves to new taxes, because if the poor can't pay anymore, well, the nobility has to come next. And there was this growing middle class of doctors and lawyers and merchants who were professionals, but not quite nobility, that also resented the rights of the aristocracy. And they were barred from the aristocracy because they were not nobles. They were not of noble birth, right? They were just doctors, lawyers, and merchants. So there was this social unrest. These also gave the French Revolution a much more violent, far-fetching, and radical character. Everybody was upset. Every walk of life was upset some way, shape, or form. And this is a huge difference between the American and French Revolution, is because they went for everybody's head in the French Revolution. Now, in the American Revolution, when it comes to government in particular, the American Revolution did not wipe out the entire ruling class. They told one ruling class to get to hell on, right? But they were able to take leaders and people who had experience leading and put them in a position of power to continue growing and leading this country, i.e., George Washington. In France, however, the people were so angry and so mad. Women stormed Versailles to drag Marie Antoinette back to Paris along with Louis XVI. They were forced to leave Versailles and move back to Paris to answer for the things that they had done. And they came for the jugular. One of the first things that they did was they stormed the Bastille. And this is where the reign of terror really comes into play. This is where the French Revolution goes from just angry mob, shouting from the sky, we need to reform government, to nobody is safe. Like, nobody. So in 1793, King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were executed. It shocked traditionalists throughout all of Europe. Every single member of nobility throughout all of Europe were quaking in their boots, because if this can happen in France, then it can happen to y'all too, buddy. So this effectively began the reign of terror. So at first, in the French Revolution, people were calling for Louis to remain as king, but have a parliament, very similar to what England was doing. It didn't work out because too many people wanted blood, and they got it. His head chopped off. So Maximilien Robespierre, in his Committee of Public Safety, he promised everyone that he would keep them safe and sound. Tens of thousands deemed enemies of the revolution would lose their lives on the guillotine, rather. Eventually, Robespierre even found himself arrested and guillotined, and he was accused of leading France into tyranny and dictatorship. Like, this is the part, if you're doing a movie on the American or the French Revolution, this is the part where you just start seeing red and blood spatter everywhere, because it really, if you looked at Robespierre the wrong way, him and his committee would deem you an enemy of the state and have you executed. So he himself was executed by Robespierre. I hope you sleep well. Headless, of course. By the way, if you are one of the people like me who often say, let them eat cake, Marie Antoinette never actually said that. It actually comes from a movie, but whatever. So what are the differences? What are the similarities between the French and the American? Well, the French differed from the American because of the way the influence spread. The US became a world power by the end of the 19th century. France kind of lost its power. France would actually end up spreading through conquest under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte. But their influence would wane greatly because of Robespierre and Napoleon. Napoleon is credited with taming the revolution and kind of, standing up for the revolution, but did he really? He did preserve civil equality. He did, have a secular law of code and religious freedom and promote by merit. But he did dispense with a lot of liberty of people. And he also created Europe's largest empire since the Roman Empire. And it ultimately brought down by resistance from Russia and Britain. It would also be one of the reasons why many European countries would establish borders, and you would start to see nationalism arise in the next chapter. By the end of this unit, by the end of this unit, we'll actually talk about the German and Italian reunification, and Napoleon is one of the reasons that brought them back together. Split them apart, if you must know. Okay, so let's talk about the Haitian Revolution. This one is another one of my favorites for many different reasons. French Revolution is because of how bloody and how just epically stupid it can be at some points in times. But the Haitian Revolution is one of those like heartwarming, feel good stories that's like this dude really came from nothing, and Haiti became the first, black run country in, the new world, but didn't get recognition for their independence from the United States in particular until 17, hold on, 1784. If you're, thinking, that sounds familiar. Or not 84, 64. 1864. Sorry, numbers all over my head. 1864. And if you're doing the history tracker of American history, that is just before the Civil War ended. So the Haitian Revolution, why do we talk about it? Well, we talk about it for a lot of different reasons. So the French Revolution had a huge influence on the French Caribbean. Saint Domingue, or Haiti, as it's later called, was a colony of the French. So Saint Domingue was the richest colony in the world. It produced 40% of the world's sugar and 50% of the world's coffee. Man, what I wouldn't give for some of their coffee right now instead of this. So the slave labor force made up the majority of the population on the island of Haiti. Shocker there, right? Whites were divided between very well-to-do plantation owners, merchants, lawyers, and then poor whites, sort of petit blanc. A third of the population were gens de l'écolière libre, which means free people of color. Many of them had actually mixed race backgrounds. France controlled the western part of the island, and then the French plantation owners would learn about the events of the French Revolution, and they would kind of get a little scared. Conditions in the island were the absolute worst in the world. Among the enslaved Africans, the death rate was around 50%. Most died from overworking in the sugar in the plantations. They would also torture slaves who resisted. It was very much common practice. And most enslaved Africans had memories of freedom in Africa. So, of course, they were going to fight back. Now, the principles behind the revolution were quite an interesting dynamic. You had the Grand Blanc, which were the rich white landowners. They wanted greater autonomy for the colony and fewer economic restrictions. Then you had the Petit Blanc, who sought equality of citizenship for all whites. Now notice that you only have Blanc here. There's nobody else. Both groups were adamantly opposed to the insistence of free people of color. They didn't want that. They actually thought that the rights of man meant equal treatment of all free people regardless of race. That's what, the free people of color thought. The Petit Leblanc did not, however. So in 1791, triggered by the rumors of the French king had, already declared an end to slavery, slaves burned 1,000 plantations and killed hundreds of whites, as well as mixed race people on the island of Haiti. These warring factions of slaves and whites and free people of color battled one another. They turned on one another. Slaves were led by Toussaint L'Ouverture, and he himself was actually a former slave. His slave owner, our former master, freed him, gave him plots of land for him and his family to live out the rest of their days on. And it is even suspected that Toussaint himself actually had slaves. And that before joining the fight for the revolution, which he didn't join right away, he actually resisted getting involved because so many times before these slave revolts ended up fizzling out and lots of people got hurt for no apparent reason. So he didn't join. And then he realized that this one was different. And so he led the slaves. He himself was a military man. He had been trained by both French and Spanish militaries, so he knew exactly how to defeat them. So Toussaint and his successor actually overcame a lot of internal resistance and defeated an attempt by Napoleon to re-establish French control. And I mean, it worked. Because enslaved Africans outnumbered whites 10 to 1, enslaved Africans were allowed to keep their African customs. This is where we get voodoo from, and it is widely practiced today throughout the Caribbean, especially in Haiti. And this religion gave the slaves a form of cultural expression and a rallying point for protest against their protesters. So, the former enslaved African who wanted to ensure the revolution took hold. So that's the reason why Toussaint got involved. He began organizing enslaved Africans into military units. He did not participate, as I said, in the initial uprising, but he was able to organize to fight not just the French, but the French, the Spanish, and the English. And all three countries wanted control of the island because of the coffee and the sugar, and they wouldn't get it. They would not get it. So how did he beat all three of these armies? Well, he joined the Spanish initially, rose to a very high rank in the Spanish army, and then when France abolished slavery, he switched sides. He was promoted to general in the French army. So Toussaint actually ruled the colony as a French governor general, and then he forced the British troops to withdraw. He defeated a mulatto group in the South in a very bloody race war. But he knew both sides, so that's how it happened. He liberated the entire island from slavery, but there was still demand of production of sugar and coffee. So he wanted to rebuild the French and Haitian economy. Napoleon sought to return Saint-Domingue to French control and reinstate slavery. So the French sent in the force. L'Ouverture is captured and imprisoned in France. So his backup, his second in command, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, led a revolt that followed the capture of L'Ouverture. And it was a horrific war that broke out, where both sides had heavy losses because France could not resupply their troops and suffered fever in the camps. Haiti wins the war in 1803. So I'm going to stop there because I'm over 30 minutes when I told you I wouldn't. In the next video, I will go on to Latin American Revolution.